Anyway, it is my total pleasure to introduce really our final outside speaker who I'm becoming his professional introducer. I introduced him a couple weeks ago in Chicago. Please grab his book. We have books on his table. If you have friends who had to leave early and didn't get one, please take one for them too. It is an extraordinary read. The End of Average, and the thesis that he's posing around our use of averages to measure people is very provocative and world-changing. Todd Rose is a professor at the Harvard Education School. He's director of the Mind, Brain, and Education program and co-founder of the Center for Individual Opportunity. He's actually done great work. Ulrich actually talked about the LEAP organization in Chicago that our dear friend Phyllis Lockett, who couldn't be here this year, but it started, and Todd is doing a lot of great work with Phyllis at LEAP in Chicago. He is the author of 2 books, including The End of Average. They're both bestsellers, and actually, I love doing this. He accomplished all this after dropping out of high school because he didn't fit into the cookie-cutter average that we often create for our children. With the support of the Zuckerbergs, Todd is actually taking this revolutionary thesis on the road, and he may give us a little bit of a look on that, but we're just so thrilled to have him here and really appreciate him having become part of our little GSV family.
So I normally don't have nightmares before giving talks, but I had this, I was thinking, the last speaker an event, I'm like, when was the last time I stayed for an entire, so I had this dream, no kidding, that I got here and there was just one person, and it was my mom. And I went through I thought, okay, it's still being filmed, so I'm gonna go through this and pretend. And afterwards I said, what do you think? And she said, do they validate parking? That was like her only, so. I don't know what this means. If you're all like psychoanalysts, we could probably work through it afterwards, but super excited and humbled to have spent this time with you all, you people that are actually building real solutions in the real world and people investing in those things during this time of kind of a Wild West. I can't imagine how challenging that is. I don't have any products to sell. I probably wouldn't be good at that, but I am a scientist, and the thing that I spend all of my time thinking about is, what does it mean to understand an individual person, whether it's in health, whether it's in mental abilities, whether it's education, workplace environments. And I think where we intersect is that we all sort of agree that we care deeply about education, and we know that the current industrial model isn't quite working. And we know the future, whatever we want to call it, personalized, adaptive, or whatever, does require something that's a little more developmental, something that's really about developing the potential of kids. And so I wrote the book and to talk about some of the work that we've been doing around what I think is one key component, a barrier really to getting to this new place we want to go. And I think, frankly, we have an assumptions problem, that we have this continued belief at the heart of our system around this myth of average, that we still feel like it's okay to think about individual kids and people and employees in reference to group averages. Either it's a type or a rank. And obviously my argument will be that that doesn't work. We know this mathematically, we know it empirically. And that I think if we want to get somewhere better in education, we've got to break this assumptions problem that we have. So I just want to spend my time the next 3 hours. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Only my students have to suffer through 3 hours of just to do 2 things really. I want to use some high tops examples from my book, which you all get, so thank you, Deb. Normally when I have to say, as I say in my book, that's my publisher makes me say that, so you don't have to buy anything. I just want to use some high tops examples to do 2 things. One is to show you what I mean when I say there's actually no such thing as an average person, and then what might we put in its place in terms of some basic principles of individuality that we could use as a foundation for a more developmental system of education. So the first thing is, the first time I ever became sort of aware of the failure of averages was back in 2002, and I was doing my doctorate at Harvard, and I was being trained in brain imaging at Mass General Hospital. And the way that things work in brain imaging, like most sciences historically, was if you were all in one of my studies, I would bring you in, I would put you in a scanner, I would give you the same task, scan your brain, and then almost reflexively would average together all of your brains and then publish that result. obviously with the assumption that the average brain would mean something, right? So we're busy learning that method of averages and using what's called random effects modeling, and a paper comes out, which actually completely rocked our field, and it's totally nerdy because it's like this study by my colleague Mike Miller at UC Santa Barbara, and it was on how the brain retrieves memory. And it was kind of boring, frankly, and I tease Mike about this all the time. And I say it's boring because even up to that point, we had well over 50 or so studies that all looked at what areas of the brain are involved in memory retrieval. So if you would have asked me, what do we know for sure back then, I would have said, we know the areas of the brain involved in memory retrieval. So I actually thought it was weird that Mike even got funding to do that kind of study. So here's what he does. He follows the same method that I just talked to you about, and he produces an average brain map, and here it is. And you'll have to trust me. These are the brain areas involved in memory retrieval on average. Looks just like every other study, more or less. But Mike did something really, really important, which will seem pretty commonsensical to you guys, but wasn't to us at the time. He happened to be in a scanning session with one person, and when they got the individual results, he said that it looked weird, which is a scientific term and so he said, it didn't look anything like what the aggregate stuff was that eventually came out. And so he just said, I wonder how many individual brains actually look like the average brain I just produced. So he went back in and looked at the individual maps. Let me just show you 3 out of these. These are all people that performed at perfect performance levels, so there's no performance differences. And these are the areas of the brain that were involved in their success. Here's one. Here's another. Kind of looks like it. And another. And I could keep going on because not a single brain in his study, not a single person had a brain that looked anything like the average. So Mike gets worried, right? Maybe you've done something. Maybe there's some error in computation or something. He doesn't publish it right away because that's how you ruin your career, right? So he lets it sit, but it keeps bothering him. And he said, okay, here's what we'll do. As a good scientist, he brought the same people back about 6 months later, put them in the exact same scanner, gave them the exact same task, got the exact same result. The average represented nobody, but what was really powerful is that the way that each individual brain was doing the task stayed stable. And off of that, we get all kinds of new insights about the strategies that brains could use to get good memory retrieval. Some people would rely more on spatial information versus verbal or pure visual. But anyway, all that's masked when you buy into this idea of an aggregate brain. So Mike Miller was the first to show us that there was no average brain. And if you build theories of brain processes on average, they could literally represent nobody. But the good news is he's not the only scientist to have discovered this. So over the past decade and a half, we've seen in every field where we've had the data to look at the individuals instead of groups, we found the exact same thing. So, for example, there's no such thing as an average cell. There's no such thing as an average genome. There's no such thing as average cancer. And what I think is probably one of the most important insights for education right now is we know for sure there's no such thing as an average student. Now, that almost seems like kind of a bumper sticker slogan, right? My kid's an honor student or my kid's not average. But if you accept that, and I think probably you do, then it's not hard to see kind of the crux of the problem, because our current industrial system was actually built with the assumption that average existed, that it was a good reference point for understanding kids at scale, right? And just think about it, even today. We still buy textbooks that we call age appropriate or developmentally appropriate, which often just means, what does the average kid of that age know and can do? When we use high stakes, a lot of our high stakes tests are norm referenced against a hypothetical average student. And we even fix the amount of time kids have to learn and the sequence with which they'll learn stuff based on what we know about learning on average, right? I always wondered, where did we come up with how much time kids have to take these tests? More often than not, it is actually how long it takes the average of a representative sample to complete it. And it's not that surprising in terms of the origins of our industrial system, because it was built by the same people who had adopted scientific management and other forms of approaches that treated individual employees in factories like cogs, where you wanted interchangeable parts, and you didn't really want to know much about their individuality. And the thing is, I'm not even saying it was a bad thing. I actually think back then, I don't know what else you would have done, and I'm not sure a highly personalized system would have produced better results that we could have exploited in the economy anyway. But I do think we could agree that times have changed and that we do need more talent and we need people reaching their full potential. And if that's the case, if that's the system we want, then averages fail. They just don't work for what we want them to do. That would be a terrible sort of ending story. So we don't know. The good news is, 10, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have known what to tell you. What would we do instead? But as I kind of hinted at the beginning of the talk, in recent years, we've got a whole new science that's swept across a whole bunch of different fields. We call it the science of the individual, science of individuality, and it's making enormous gains across all kinds of fields. For example, the vast majority of improvements in cancer identification and treatment have come from getting away from the assumptions of averages and finding out there's patterns of individuality give rise to different sequences of different kinds of cancers. We've seen this in personalized nutrition. We've even seen it in performance reviews and evaluations in workplace environments. Where it's been harder to get traction has been in education. But I do think the good news is, again, we can use this same kind of science as a better foundation for building more personalized, equitable systems at scale. So for the last couple of minutes, I just want to do some high tops examples of, out of this science, we focus on 3 patterns of individuality. It's not everything. There's enormously important qualitative aspects to being a person that need to be taken into consideration. But in terms of patterns that we could use to understand kids and build them into our systems and scale, I just want to introduce you these things. We call them jaggedness, context, and pathways. In the book, which I guess I hope you'll read, well, I'll go deeper into all of these, but this will be some high tops examples. So the first principle is called jaggedness, and simply stated, it's that any human characteristic that we care about is multidimensional and can never be reduced to a single score, ever. Now, that almost doesn't seem that controversial, but almost everything we do reduces kids to a number or a category, and we think it's explanatory, but it's really not. So let me tell you about the first time we realized this idea of jaggedness, and it came from the first time we recognized there was no such thing as average body size. So it's early 1950s. The US Air Force has just gone from propeller planes to jet-powered aviation. And we've gone from the speed of whatever propellers are, which isn't that fast, to close to the speed of sound, high-altitude flying with all kinds of new technologies on board. Invested enormous amounts of money in these new planes because everyone knew after World War II that wars were going to be Air Force wars now. The assumption was we would get enormous performance gains from these new planes, but the exact opposite happened. Performance just flat out plummeted. Not only did that happen, we had huge amounts of accidents and deaths, and no one could figure it out. Went through this whole cycle of the blame game, which I feel like really mirrors education. At first, no kidding, the generals blamed the pilots. They said, maybe this generation doesn't have literally the right stuff. But then they found old World War II aces were having the exact same kind of problems. One of my board members of my nonprofit was actually a pilot during this phase, so it's been interesting to hear his personal take on the blame game there. But they also blamed flight instructors, that maybe we weren't teaching them the right way. They revamped that and nothing happened. So finally they figured out what the core problem was, and it was actually with the design of the cockpit itself. Let me explain. So since the first time we built a plane for the military back in 1922, we had to come up with this problem, which is we knew our pilots had different body sizes, but you could only make one cockpit. So the question was, how do you design one single cockpit that could accommodate the widest range of pilots? And the assumption was, that went back all the way to the Civil War, was that if you wanted to design the most flexible cockpit, you design for the average body size of a pilot. So what they would do is they'd take all the dimensions that matter, which by the way is only 10, believe it or not, to design a cockpit, find the average for the pilots that exist, and build a cockpit across all those dimensions. So they'd done that. Now the general said, wait a minute. It's 1950. Clearly we've gotten bigger, so maybe this average is out of date. So they commissioned the largest study in history of body size at the time, over 4,000 pilots. And they hired this guy, Gilbert Daniels, who's my absolute favorite person. I wrote about him in the book, but I got to talk to him. He's like 90 years old right now. He was 23 at the time. He never had been in the military, but he was in physical anthropology. And so he knew a little bit about body size and stuff. So they literally brought him in and said, you're the guy that's going to go measure They did 147 dimensions of body size, including like toe length and stuff like this. And he's the guy with the tape measure. And even at 90, he was like, this is mind-numbingly like the worst job I ever had, right? But as he's flying around measuring all these pilots, since he's the guy that's doing it, he starts to see so much variation in the pilots themselves. And he starts to think maybe the core problem is with the very concept of an average body size. Because he noticed, the tall person isn't always like the heaviest person, right? And so he goes to the generals and says, I think the problem is average. And they were like, what? Right? And they tried to explain it, and they said, look, just give us the data that we want. So he convinces them to do a side study at night. And all he asks is this basic question. He takes the 10 dimensions of size that really matter the most for design of cockpits and asks, how many of the 4,037 pilots are actually average on these dimensions of size? And he's super generous. It's not a point estimate. It's plus or minus 15% for each dimension. So the generals literally said, well, fine, do it, but we already know what the answer is, right? Because, by the way, these were white males who were picked because they fit into an average-sized cockpit. So he gets done with his study, and here's what he finds. 0. Not a single one of those pilots was actually average on any of those, on the total dimensions. And in fact, if you just reduced it to 3, like height and chest circumference and hip to waist ratio, only less than 5% were average. So he realized immediately that if you designed a cockpit for an average body size, you've literally designed it for nobody. And maybe it didn't matter when you were going at the speed of propellers, but when you're going close to the speed of sound, where split-second decisions are life or death, success or failure, fit really matters, right? So to their everlasting credit, the military, which I always think of as the most hierarchical conservative institution we have, immediately, within like 18 months, bans the use of averages in design. And oh my goodness, did people kick up a fuss. You read the congressional records of they went right to they lobbied and said it will be impossible to design flexible cockpits. One producer, Douglas, at the time said, are you kidding me? Are we supposed to build a cockpit for everyone, right? And it turned out they didn't budge, and within just a few months, we got adjustable seats. That technology was not even in the planes we had because it didn't matter. It didn't seem to matter. So I will say what I wanted to show you briefly is why it is that there's no such thing as average body size, right? So here are two people. This is actual data. The images are obviously not of pilots, but at least one of them probably wouldn't make it. But this is real data from Gilbert Daniels. And if you look at them across these dimensions, you can see obviously that, look, size is not one-dimensional, right? If I asked you this basic question, which one of these people is bigger? It feels like there should be an easy answer, right? But bigger is not one-dimensional, right? If I said which one's taller, we can actually have that conversation. But what we found is every single pilot, every single one of them had this kind of jagged profile, so that they'd be on the high end on some dimensions, in the middle on others, and on the low end of other dimensions. What's really funny is if you average together these dimensions, they're the exact same. These two men are the same size on average. So what's important is, it's one thing to have jagged size profiles, but this same thing holds in every other place we've looked in terms of actually character shows this jaggedness, this multidimensionality with weak correlations, but so do things like intelligence. This is like one of the most well-known things from the beginning of intelligence testing, that sure, we can take two women on an adult intelligence scale and we can average those subtests and we can call them the exact same intelligence. If we don't care to know them or nurture their potential, then maybe it's enough to just call it 103. But if now our job is to know who they are and get the most out of what they could be, it kind of matters that they have very different profiles of strengths and weaknesses. So, basic idea of jaggedness, multidimensionality, those dimensions don't really correlate like we think, so you can't reduce people to single scores. I think that has huge implications for the way we diagnose everything from giftedness to learning disabled to the way we design textbooks and stuff. And there's really neat design frameworks like Universal Design for Learning, which actually targets jaggedness and designs for it. But I talk about more of that in my book. Second principle, context principle. Simply stated, it's not very useful to talk about behavior, learning, and performance independent of the immediate environment in which you're behaving, learning, and performing. I could use tons of examples of this, of all the things we've learned when we take context seriously. I think it's not even remotely controversial. Anyone that's worked with kids or employees or anything understands the situation really does matter. So what I wanted to talk to you about is, I think about this all the time. If we all kind of agree that the situation would matter, why do we find it so difficult to take that seriously, right? We still default to things like personality tests that are completely decontextualized, performance profiles that are completely decontextualized. And I think one of the reasons we're hesitant to go toward taking context seriously is that we think that it will be messy or incredibly complex or complicated. And that could be true, but in fact, I'll show you an example here that from the science perspective, the exact opposite has turned out to be true basically every single time we've taken context seriously. Whether it's been in identification of cancer cells, we use the microenvironment because you can't really diagnose cancer cells without taking seriously the immediate environment the cell lives in. But my favorite story of all time, this comes from this new science, one of the pioneers, Esther Thalin, just to show you what can happen in terms of simplifying instead of making it complicated. How many of you, I guess we already asked this, have kids? Okay. So when little kids are born, between like birth and like 2 months of age roughly, if you hold them upright like this, they take these steps. And it looks like they can walk, right? So I was completely duped by this because I got married, well, you heard a little bit of it, I dropped out of high school, but I also, my girlfriend, who's still my wife today, got pregnant at the same time. We lived in rural Utah. That was not a good start. I tell you all this so you don't take life advice from me. This is if you only take one thing from this talk, whatever else I tell you. My first son, Austin, no kidding, he was born, and I happened to be playing with him, and he did this stepping. I honestly thought he was walking, right? I got so excited, and I called my mom, and she's a nurse, and I said, Mom, Austin's walking. And I had already had dreams of Olympic athlete, these things. And she said, he's 1.5 months old. I don't think he's walking. I said, no. So I explained it to her, and she said, oh, look, that's a reflex. It's called the step reflex. It will go away. I was like, what? Why would a reflex go away? So this idea of it's true. At about 2 months of age, it disappears, only to come back right before kids learn to walk. So this idea of the disappearing step reflex puzzled not just me, but scientists for generations. And in the early 60s, using methods of average, we came up with the only correlation we could really find about what might be driving this. And we decided it was brain maturation. And the theory was the parts of the frontal areas that are in charge of motor stuff will myelinate and suppress the reflex, and then it comes back under voluntary control right before the kid walks. It was kind of complicated. The correlations were incredibly weak, but that was the best we had. And so we ran with it, and we thought we knew the cause of the disappearing step reflex. And it got so clear that we put it into every pediatric textbook up until the mid-'80s said this is it, right? But what happened is, if your kid didn't lose their stepping reflex by about 2 months of age, it was taken as a sign of neurological delay. We'd put you in remediation, and we got really good at remediation. So this nice little loop, we figured we nailed this, right? Till this scientist who was one of the pioneers of this new field of the science of individual, Esther Thalin, University of Indiana, has since passed away, but she came from biology originally, had been trained in dynamic systems, and she said, this just seems ridiculous, right? You only have to be around some kids to realize that's probably not the answer. So she did some amazing studies, and some of the videos are on YouTube. She measures the kids' jagged size, different dimensions of body size. She puts them in different contexts, including, no kidding, putting little kids on treadmills, which is hilarious. They stay up pretty well. I mean, not just by themselves, but I don't know. I guess this one's way better to look at. So she does these things. She puts them in water to see the effect of buoyancy. And she lands on what the actual cause of the disappearing step reflex was. Chubby thighs. That's it. About 2 months of age, little kids get a burst of subcutaneous fat on their thighs, and they just can't lift their legs when you hold them like this. That's it. She developed a precise mathematical model that could predict when any individual kid would lose their reflex, when it would come back. So then I thought, like, okay, I guarantee you've never heard of, in the annals of science, chubby thighs as an answer. But think how simple that is. We made this elaborate explanation of like brain maturation off of limited correlations. But here's what I think is really important about this story. We sent kids to remediation and worried parents to no end. And guess what? We had a 99.6 or 7% success rate in remediation because nothing was wrong. Right? So believe me when I say, if we get serious about taking context into account, it doesn't have to make it more complicated. In a lot of ways, it will clarify and simplify where average is obscure. And we're seeing that in all kinds of really cool areas that I talk about in the book. Last one is the pathways principle, and simply stated is that individuals differ naturally in the pace and sequence with which they accomplish outcomes. And as a result, there are always multiple pathways to success. Always. Always, always, always. In fact, from complex systems, it's like the only law we have. It's called equifinality. Like, we know this to be true. There are always multiple pathways. And yet, if you think about education or the workplace, all of our models look like this. It's like a development model, or a ladder model, right? That we basically, your development is like rungs of a ladder, and this is what you'll always get when you average together a bunch of people and look for stages. You're going to find these things. But in most of my work, I focus on sequencing and pathway development. But here I just want to touch on briefly, let's pretend once we've soldered in one pathway, we still, I think when I talk to people, no one disagrees that kids differ in pace. I've never heard someone say, no, I think everyone's average paced. But what we do think, what is very, very pervasive, is this idea that fast is smart. And I'll tell you what, when I first started this work, I definitely thought that was true. I definitely thought there has to be some correlation. But here's what's interesting. In writing the book and digging into the background of this, the person that soldered that idea into our whole education system was Edward Thorndike, the father of educational psychology. He deeply believed that intelligence was about how fast your brain could make connections. And he believed that you were born genetically with a brain that was a certain speed. And so he's the guy that's standardizing almost everything early in the system. And so when it comes time to think about how long should we give kids to learn and how long should we give them to take a test, he thinks he's doing the most democratic thing he could, which was a stretch for him. But he says, what if we pegged it to the average? Because sure, the fast, smart kids might be a little bored sometimes, but look, the truth is, if you're below average on the curve in speed, you're not smart enough to take advantage of the extra time. That is so pervasive in our system right now. It's even to this day, if I said, oh, you're a fast learner, you think I said you're smart, right? So it turns out when you look at the individual level instead of aggregate stuff, that relationship between pace and ability completely disappears. If anything, when we do studies looking about 2 months out, how well you retain information, people that take a little longer remember more, if anything. But the thing we can say for sure is there just isn't a relationship between pace and ability. And so most of you how many of you are familiar with Benjamin Bloom? So perfect. This is the good thing about ed tech is people know usually what the 2 Sigma challenge was and this. We've known this for a really long time, that if you just give a little more flexibility in terms of the pace with which kids can learn, it's shocking what kids can accomplish. And what I love about, if you go back and look at Benjamin Bloom's original work that came up with that 2 Sigma challenge, they gave some individual tutoring. They gave this exact same amount of time that kids had compared to the control group. They just let them move at their own pace within that total amount of instructional time. So anyway, the 2 Sigma challenge, if anyone isn't familiar with it, I apologize. I'll definitely send you some reading material. What I want to show you is just a snapshot data from Bloom's actual data back in 1980s, just to show, look, just because we have a new science doesn't mean these are all brand new insights. They've been really smart people for a long time. Bloom had put people in the control group, which was fixed pace. The test is given, frankly, arbitrarily, right? There's no real reason when it is we decide to give a test. But then the other group got a little more time, and like they could take the test when they're ready. So here's like 5 kids, just anecdotally, but we can talk about the more quantitative stuff in a minute. This is on, I believe it was on math, if I remember right. These 5 kids, obviously this kid at the bottom definitely doesn't understand, right? But with a little more time, he ends up being the top kid in the class. Now, I just show you this just to visualize 5 data points. This is one of the most robust findings we have in education. When you give a little more flexibility, it's amazing how many kids can get to mastery. If you want to see the deeper big data aspect of this, is look at what Sal Khan's doing. So I'm on his advisory board, and he's seen this. He talks about it in his TED Talk, which he does a good job of showing like basically this kind of effect over and over and over again. When you have some flexibility, some kids take a little longer, and then they take off. And he's got it at a huge scale. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think that sometimes we think dealing with individuality must mean these massive, massive changes. But Bloom showed us 40 years ago that a little bit of flexibility and pace could go a long way. Okay, so averages don't work if you want a system that understands and develops individuals. I think we have a better science with better foundation for getting somewhere at scale. As a scientist, I sort of thought naively that having that information would be good enough. And I mean that naively. Like, well, we know this is better. We know averages aren't right. And then I was like, well, why isn't anything changing, right? And you realize this is actually not just about being right. This is about changing mindset. Because the public still has a deeply ingrained sense of human potential based around this old average-based thinking. And to show you what I mean and why it's about changing fundamental assumptions, I want to tell you one last story. And this is actually the reason why I chose to write a book in the first place. Because the Air Force was actually not the first organization to figure out that there's no such thing as average body size. So 7 years before that, in the early 1940s, the head of the American Gynecological Association, Robert Dickinson, who was obsessed with averages too because he believed that those were typical, normal kinds of things, decides for the good of physicians and the good of humanity, he was going to commission the building of a sculpture of an average American woman. He collects data from over 18,000 women, measures them on close to 200 dimensions, including, again, like toe length and weird things like that, and creates a statue that was meant to be given to physicians and everything to show what a normal, typical woman should look like. Not surprisingly, he called her Norma. Now, by the way, there was a Norman, and no one cared. But I'll show you just briefly. This is Norma on a pedestal. It becomes an absolute overnight sensation in the United States. People were obsessed with her. I'm not kidding you, there are literally a couple of dozen newspaper reports. One pastor wrote about Norma's normal religious beliefs. It was so weird. This was during the war, and they had front page stuff in the Cleveland Plain Dealer about surrendering, for a war, and what's up with Norma, right? That's how obsessed we were with her. It got so bad. Oh, by the way, she was on a talk show. No, she didn't have much to say because she was a statue, but she was on a talk show where they read out her dimensions and were like, "Are you normal?" It was just so weird. It got so crazy that they did a nationwide Norma lookalike contest and told women, send in your dimensions. And they even had showing friends measuring each other. Send them in and you could win a $100 war bond. And it was all gimmicky. They just wanted people to get interested in these statues, and they had miniature statues to hand out. So they had thousands and thousands of women send in their dimensions. And they really expected that, first of all, you're choosing to send in your dimensions, so you kind of think you look like Norma. They thought basically almost everyone that sent them in would be really close. So they decided we've got to have a policy for how we randomly judge the winner, right, and pick the winner. So no kidding, they had the YMCA decide, which I think is kind of funny. And so they have all this in place, and they announce the winner, Martha Skidmore, and she looks nothing like Norma. And it was obvious to anyone. They put her on a pedestal next to Norma, and they printed it in the paper, and people were like, what? And so they finally had to come out and say, okay, she was only average on 3 of the 9 dimensions they used. And she was the winner. Because it turns out they had to admit, not a single woman who submitted their dimensions was average on all 9 dimensions. So you would think Here they have the exact same data, more or less, that the Air Force has. And you would think the easy answer here was, we know what the problem is. There's no average female body size. Let's do away with that. That's not what happens. So the guy that's running the whole event, Bruno Gebhardt, from the Cleveland Health Museum, he goes with a reporter, and this gets written up in the paper. He says, I know exactly what the problem is. American women are profoundly unfit. And what we need is PE programs. And I'm not kidding you, they made miniature Norma statues, replicas, and sent them all over the country. And young high school women were measuring their body dimensions against Norma and prescribed specific exercises to become more normal. So for me, when we sit here today, we think about all the things we could do with personalization, more development models of education. And I'm a big, huge fan of data, but I think there's a sense sometimes in the public or in other places, hopefully not here, that if we just collect more data, that we're going to get to personalization and we're going to get to this positive place. But if Norma's any indicator, I'm not sure that's true. Right? I don't see, without a mindset change, how we don't just double down on this like micro-typing and micro-ranking of kids and get to this place that none of us wants to be a part of. So for me, I think we're in a good place, but I do think that at the end of the day, this is an assumptions problem. This is one piece of it, and that we have an opportunity to change the public mindset. So I'll just end by saying the book was meant to see if anyone would care. That's literally what my board told me. Let's just see. And it's been very successful. I'm very, very happy. And we've spent the last year building a plan for a broad social movement to take these even more ideas and make them more accessible and start to influence the way the general public sees themselves and the people around them. And we believe deeply that if we can create a different set of assumptions about human potential in the general public, that it will soften the ground for the kind of solutions that we need to come, and that we can create the sustained public demand that I think will be an essential part of a virtuous kind of cycle. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time.